This amateur work would embarrass our family name at the Heritage Festival, my mother-in-law Margaret declared, her scissors slicing through what she thought was my grandmother's cherished quilt. I stood in her craft room, watching as she butchered the fabric with her improvements, each cut making my heart race, not from distress, but from the effort of hiding my smile. My name is Linda Parker, and at 34, I've spent the last decade perfecting the art of dealing with Margaret Wells, the self-proclaimed queen of the local quilting society. She'd never forgiven me for stealing her precious son David away from the wealthy socialite she handpicked for him. The fact that David and I fell in love while restoring vintage motorcycles, another hobby she deemed unsuitable for a Wells, only added fuel to her disapproval. The festival judges expect perfection, Margaret continued, her perfectly manicured nails tracing over the quilt's surface. These primitive stitches would never win. Really, Linda, if your grandmother was any good at quilting, why didn't she ever enter competitions? I bit my tongue, remembering Grandma Rose's words. Sometimes, sweetheart, the best victory is the one only you know about. My grandmother had been my rock, raising me after my parents' accident when I was 12. She taught me everything: cooking, gardening, and most importantly, the art of quilting. But not just any quilting. Rose Mitchell had a secret technique, one passed down through generations of women in our family. You're right, Margaret, I said softly, watching her pause mid-cut, clearly surprised by my easy agreement. Grandma never did enter any competitions. What I didn't mention was that Rose Mitchell's quilts were actually highly sought after by collectors who recognized her unique signature pattern. A subtle, almost invisible variation in the stitching that made her quilts not just beautiful, but valuable pieces of folk art. Only a handful of her quilts existed, and fewer still had her special pattern. Margaret's eyes narrowed at my compliance. She was used to our subtle battles, my quiet resistance to her attempts to improve everything about me. Well, she said, clearly thrown off balance, I'm glad you're finally seeing reason. This pattern is outdated, the stitching is uneven, and honestly, the color choices are questionable at best. I nodded, picking up a piece of the fabric she'd discarded. The quilt she was destroying was actually a clever replica I'd made specifically for this moment. After years of Margaret's not-so-subtle hints about fixing my grandmother's work, I prepared for the inevitable. The real heirloom was safely stored in a climate-controlled unit across town, along with Grandma's other precious pieces. The Heritage Festival is in 3 days, Margaret announced, pulling out her own expensive fabrics. I'll rework this into something presentable. The Wells family has won the quilting competition for the past 5 years, and I won't let that streak end because of inferior materials. I watched as she began laying out her design, all sharp angles and modern patterns, nothing like the intricate flowing designs my grandmother had created. Margaret's quilts were technically perfect, machine precise, and utterly soulless. She'd never understood that quilting wasn't just about perfect stitches, it was about telling a story through fabric and thread. Would you like help? I offered, knowing her answer before she spoke. Oh no, dear, she said with false sweetness. Why don't you focus on the bake sale instead? Simple things are more your speed. I left her craft room, my phone buzzing with a text from David. Mom's still improving things. My husband knew all about his mother's attempts to remake me into her idea of a proper Wells wife. He'd offered to intervene countless times, but I'd always declined. Some battles were worth fighting quietly. Just fixing Grandma's quilt, I texted back. Everything's going according to plan. Later that evening, as Margaret proudly showed off her progress to David and his father George, I slipped away to my craft room. Hidden behind panels of fabric samples and sewing supplies was a small safe. Inside lay my real entry for the Heritage Festival, a quilt I'd spent the past year creating, incorporating every technique my grandmother had taught me. The pattern seemed simple at first glance, a traditional tree of life design rendered in subtle shades of blue, green, and gold. But within the pattern, visible only to those who knew where to look, was Rose Mitchell's signature technique. Each stitch told a story, creating a secondary pattern that emerged only when the light hit it just right. It was more than a quilt. It was a piece of my history, my grandmother's legacy woven into every careful stitch. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Susan, the Heritage Festival's head judge. Everything set for Friday. Your grandmother would be proud. I smiled, remembering the last conversation I'd had with Grandma Rose before she passed away 2 years ago. She'd made me promise to keep our family's quilting tradition alive, but to do it my way. Patience and precision, dear, she'd said, her hands shaking but still able to demonstrate the special stitch one last time. Those who know will know. Margaret's voice carried down the hallway, discussing her plans to display her improved version of my family quilt. It'll be a surprise for everyone, she declared. No one will expect such a modern take on a traditional pattern. Linda will thank me when we win. I closed my safe quietly, touching the simple gold locket I always wore, the one containing a small piece of my grandmother's first quilt. Oh, Margaret, I whispered to myself, you have no idea how right you are about the surprises in store at the festival. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret worked feverishly on her improvement project, completely transforming what she thought was my family heirloom into something unrecognizable. I kept myself busy helping with festival preparations, setting up display areas, and carefully avoiding any mention of quilts or competitions. The evening before the festival, as I carefully packed my real entry away, David came into our room. Mom's finally finished, he said, running a hand through his hair, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. She wants everyone to see it at breakfast tomorrow before we head to the festival. I leaned into his embrace, feeling the rumble of his laugh. You're really going to let her show that thing to everyone? Sometimes, I said, echoing my grandmother's wisdom, the best lessons come from letting people believe they've won. David kissed the top of my head. Rose Mitchell's granddaughter through and through. Mom has no idea what's coming, does she? I smiled, thinking of the judges' faces when they'd seen my test pieces of the quiet arrangements we'd made for the festival's special exhibition. Let's just say the Heritage Festival is going to be very interesting this year. The morning of the Heritage Festival dawned bright and clear. I sat at Margaret's immaculate dining room table, watching her unveil her masterpiece to the family. The quilt she created from the remnants of my decoy was exactly what I'd expected, technically perfect and completely devoid of character. Notice how I've modernized the dated pattern, Margaret explained, gesturing to the sharp geometric shapes she'd incorporated. The judges will appreciate the innovation. It's a perfect blend of traditional and contemporary. She paused, fixing me with a pointed look. Much better than the original, don't you think, Linda? David squeezed my hand under the table as I nodded pleasantly. It's certainly different, I replied, causing my father-in-law George to hide a smile behind his coffee cup. Unlike his wife, George had always treated me with quiet kindness. He even confided once that I reminded him of his own mother, who had also preferred working with her hands to attending social functions. Different. Margaret's eyes narrowed. It's exceptional. The Wells family has a reputation to uphold at the festival. We can't have subpar work associated with our name. I thought about my quilt, carefully packed away in its acid-free box. Grandma Rose had always said that true craftsmanship speaks for itself. No need for grand announcements or self-promotion. The quality of the work would always shine through to those who understood it. The Heritage Festival was already bustling when we arrived. The town square had been transformed with white tents and colorful banners, the air filled with the scent of kettle corn and the sound of bluegrass music. Margaret immediately commandeered several volunteers to help her set up her display, positioning her quilt prominently in the center of the Wells family booth. Linda, she called out, make yourself useful and hand out these promotional cards. People should know where this piece came from. The cards, I noticed, made no mention of my grandmother's original work, crediting only Margaret Wells for the design. Actually, I said, checking my phone, I'm needed at the registration tent. They're short-handed this morning. Before Margaret could protest, I slipped away through the crowd. Instead of heading to registration, I made my way to a small tent at the far end of the square. Susan, the head judge, was waiting for me. Everything's ready, she said, helping me unpack my quilt. The special exhibition space is prepared exactly as we discussed. We carefully hung my piece, adjusting the lighting until it was perfect. In the proper light, my grandmother's signature pattern emerged. Subtle variations in the stitching that created a secondary design, visible only to those who knew what to look for. It was like a secret language passed down through generations of women in my family. Rose would be so proud, Susan murmured, stepping back to admire the work. I remember when she taught at the college's textile program. None of us could ever quite figure out how she achieved this effect. I smiled, remembering countless hours spent practicing with my grandmother, her patient hands guiding mine through the complex stitching pattern. It took me years to master it, I admitted. Every time I thought I had it, she'd show me something new, some tiny detail I'd missed. Back at the main exhibition area, Margaret was holding court, describing her innovative techniques to a group of polite listeners. I caught David's eye and winked, our signal that everything was in place. The judging began at noon. Margaret stood proudly by her display, confident in her inevitable victory. I watched as the judges made their rounds, taking notes and examining each entry carefully. When they reached Margaret's quilt, she launched into her prepared speech about modernizing traditional patterns. "And where did the original design come from?" one judge asked, adjusting her glasses. "Oh, it was just an old family piece," Margaret said dismissively. "Quite primitive, really. I saw the potential and gave it the refinement it needed." The judge made a non-committal noise and moved on, leaving Margaret slightly flustered. This wasn't following her usual script of effusive praise and immediate recognition. At 2 o'clock, Susan took the stage for the special announcement we planned. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice rang out over the festival grounds, "this year we have a unique privilege. Many of you may remember Rose Mitchell, whose quilts were legendary in our community." I saw Margaret's head snap up at the mention of my grandmother's name. "We're honored to present a special exhibition of Rose Mitchell's work, including a never-before-seen piece that demonstrates her famous hidden pattern technique." Susan paused, letting the murmur of excitement ripple through the crowd. "Even more special, this new work comes from her granddaughter, who has mastered Rose's unique method." The crowd began moving toward the small tent, Margaret among them, her face a mix of confusion and disbelief. I stayed back, watching as people filed in to view my quilt. From where I stood, I could hear the gasps of recognition from those who had known my grandmother's work, the excited whispers as they pointed out the subtle pattern emerging in the light. "It can't be," I heard Margaret say, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Linda doesn't, she couldn't." But I could and I had. Years of patience, practice, and quiet determination had led to this moment, not for revenge or triumph, but for honor. Honor of my grandmother's legacy, her art, and her wisdom. David appeared at my side, slipping an arm around my waist. "Should we go in?" he asked softly. I leaned into his embrace, watching as Margaret stood frozen before my quilt, her carefully constructed world of superiority crumbling around her. "Not yet," I said. "Let's give her a moment to process it all." Through the tent's opening, I could see my quilt catching the afternoon light, the hidden pattern shimmering like a secret finally revealed. Grandma Rose had always said that the best lessons come when we least expect them, and that true art speaks to the heart without needing to raise its voice. I touched my locket, feeling the small piece of my grandmother's first quilt safely tucked inside. Somewhere, I knew she was watching, and I hoped she was proud of how I'd chosen to reveal her legacy, not with anger or confrontation, but with the quiet confidence she had always taught me to embrace. The afternoon light filtered through the festival tents as I finally made my way to the special exhibition space. Margaret stood there, still staring at my quilt, her face a complex mixture of emotions. For once, she seemed at a loss for words. "The secret is in the tension of each stitch," I said quietly, moving to stand beside her. Grandma Rose spent years perfecting it. She said the trick was knowing exactly how much pressure to apply. Too much, and the pattern becomes obvious. Too little, and it disappears completely. Margaret turned to me, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw something different in her eyes. Not judgment or criticism, but a glimmer of understanding. "The one I modified," she said hesitantly. "It wasn't the real one, was it?" I shook my head. "No, I knew how much you wanted to improve my grandmother's work, so I made a replica. The original is safe, along with her other pieces." "Why did you ever say anything about your skills, about Rose's technique?" I thought carefully before answering. Grandma always said that true mastery doesn't need to announce itself. She taught me that sometimes the quietest voice carries the most weight. Susan approached us, her judge's clipboard in hand. "Linda, would you mind explaining the technique to our visitors? We have quite a crowd gathering." For the next hour, I demonstrated the basics of the stitching pattern, carefully explaining how each element worked together to create the hidden design. Margaret stayed at the back of the group, watching intently as I worked. I could see her hands moving slightly, unconsciously mimicking the motions I was showing. Later, as the festival was winding down and the awards were being announced, Margaret approached me again. She held her honorable mention ribbon, twisting it between her fingers. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Your grandmother, she taught at the college?" "Yes, in the textile arts program. She loved sharing her knowledge with anyone who wanted to learn." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Do you teach?" The question caught me off guard. "Sometimes. Small groups usually, people who are interested in traditional techniques." "Would you consider?" She paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Would you consider teaching me? The real way, I mean, not just the surface level stuff I've been doing." I studied my mother-in-law's face, seeing past the perfect makeup and carefully maintained exterior to something vulnerable underneath. "It's not easy," I warned. "It takes patience, practice, and a willingness to make mistakes." "I know," she said quietly, "but I think it's time I learned." David found us sitting together at my demonstration table, where I was showing Margaret the basic framework of my grandmother's technique. He raised his eyebrows in surprise but smiled warmly. "Mom," he said, "they're asking for all the winners to gather for photos." Margaret looked at her honorable mention ribbon, then at my Best in Show award. "You go ahead, Linda. You earned it." "Actually," I said, standing up, "why don't you come with me? We can talk more about those lessons afterward." As we walked together toward the photography area, I touched the locket at my neck, thinking of Grandma Rose. She'd always insisted that the true value of any skill lay not in keeping it to yourself, but in sharing it with others, even those who might have once dismissed it. The festival ended as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the town square. As we packed up our quilts and displays, Margaret helped me carefully fold my winning piece. "You know," she said, smoothing the fabric with unexpected gentleness, "I always wondered why Rose Mitchell never entered competitions. Now I understand. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone." I smiled, remembering my grandmother's quiet confidence. She used to say that competitions were just one way to measure success. The real achievement was in creating something that would last, something that would tell our stories long after we're gone. That evening, as David and I drove home, he reached over and squeezed my hand. "You've changed something in her, you know. I've never seen Mom willing to admit she has something to learn." I thought about Margaret's request for lessons, about the genuine interest I'd seen in her eyes as I demonstrated the stitching technique. Sometimes people just need to be shown a different way of seeing things. The next morning, I received a text from Margaret. "When can we start the lessons?" I smiled as I typed my reply, thinking of Grandma Rose and her patient teachings. Some traditions weren't meant to be modernized or improved, but rather preserved and passed on with love and understanding. As I set up my sewing room for Margaret's first lesson, I knew that while the stitches might not be perfect at first, we were creating something more valuable than just another quilt. We were stitching together a new chapter in our family's story. And somewhere, I was sure, Grandma Rose was smiling.